In the past, I've discussed several times what the idea of horror and being scared means to me personally. The conclusion I oftentimes reach tends to relate towards a segmentation within this horror genre, with this going for all kinds of art forms. Let's think of this in the context of a varying scale. I'd place a technique like jump scares on one end of the spectrum, and something like the atmosphere on the other. In many pieces of media I've witnessed in the past, both of these things have had the potential to create a frightening experience. However, they achieve this in two completely separate manners. Like most things, I believe that when aiming to create anything that irks the feeling of horror, you should be aiming to lie directly in the middle of this spectrum. We've seen many times that when a piece of media relies too much on something like jump scares, audiences tend to criticize these scares for feeling cheap. An interesting point to consider. Although the scare itself may achieve its goal effectively of startling someone, if you introduce it without any real setup, audiences generally aren't satisfied. Same goes for the atmosphere, however, although I'd say to a lesser extent. There are certain horror experiences I've played which rely purely on atmosphere, but the criticisms you start to hear on this end of the spectrum relate more to the feeling of an anticlimax. If the atmosphere that's being created isn't impactful enough, this equally can lead to a pretty unsatisfying experience. Getting a build-up from things like the world, scenery, and audio, but there not being any crescendo that almost completes the horror. This is a more interesting element to observe though, as when you start playing around with these psychological elements, that can be when the most horrific concepts are revealed. Obviously in this video, we'll be observing these things in the context of video games, and there's countless examples of games that achieve what I'm describing effectively. Games like Silent Hill 2 primarily work off the stark atmosphere of the town itself, with the chilling soundtrack and mysterious fog perpetually keeping you in a state of unease. But this is where we can look to other art forms and get a more refined idea of what it is we're actually looking for in something like a horror video game. Paintings are debatably the key example I look to when it comes to creating a chilling scene in the most direct manner possible. Unlike a film or game, a painting in itself is working purely off the still image that's been painted on the canvas. Inherently, there's no audio that goes along with the painting except what you're actively hearing around you, and there's nothing else to observe except the sole painting. There's no new environment you can journey to, or a new scene that creates a different atmosphere. And yet, I've witnessed both in myself and in many other people's reactions that certain paintings can strike fear into an observer more effectively than any other format. Interestingly, I find this fear can be garnered from two different points of view, one with context and one without. This opens up a whole new gateway when it comes to what makes something scary. Take this painting for example by Brian Charnley. What initially seems like a piece of abstract art becomes considerably darker when discovering this is supposed to be the final painting in a series of self-portraits, all of which were cataloguing Charnley's declining mental state while grappling with schizophrenia. You remove the context, there's nothing particularly dark or creepy whatsoever about this painting, but with it, the painting tells a whole different story. Because of this, I now understand why there's so many people who wander around art galleries gazing at certain paintings for hours on end. In many instances, you're lacking context as to why particular images were painted, and what they're truly attempting to convey. And while this won't always relate to horror, the unknown is something that's used frequently to spark chilling ideas in a person's mind. So as we've now established, horror can be presented in several different forms, but not all of these forms will be effective. When it comes down to the individual, there'll more than likely be someone out there who enjoys something which the vast majority dislike. But looking from a more general perspective, a good piece of horror generally has traits like a strong atmosphere, distinct, unique visuals, which could translate to anything from the characters to the world, using audio to create an impact, which as we discussed, can be achieved in both an explicit or more subtle manner. And ultimately, all these kinds of things should lead to an experience where the audience isn't simply playing or watching to see what happens next. Although that may be a factor, horror, more than any other genre, aims to create a more visceral response. You're not simply watching a story play out, you're watching fearfully. And in regards to what we'll be discussing today, while getting scares from the audience still remains the key trait, those story elements I mentioned are gone about in a fairly unique manner, turning what appears like a rather typical narrative when being broken down into one that's filled millions of players with a sense of intrigue. This is Scott Cawthon, and at this point, it's undeniable that he is single-handedly responsible for one of the biggest horror franchises ever created. Being born in Bell County, Texas, not much is known about the truly early stages of Cawthon's life, which is primarily due to how he's purposely removed himself from the spotlight at almost every single opportunity. Because of this, it's unclear when exactly he attained the want to pursue things like animation or game development. However, with him attending the Art Institute of Houston in 1996, where he would have been around 18 years old at the time, it's clear that he was likely always interested invested in more creative ventures. The course he was taking focused on the creation of computer graphics, which obviously consists of quite a broad spectrum of topics. A few examples would be the creation of 3D models, how to design a practical and stylish user interface, shaders, geometry, and so on. All things you can naturally assume play a large factor when it comes to game development. So it's no real surprise that during this time studying at the Art Institute, Cawthon started teaching himself how to develop his own video games. This is where we have to understand that during this time, game engines were nowhere near as available as they are now. Freely accessible and popular engines like Unity, Unreal, and GameMaker literally didn't exist yet. And we also have to bear in mind that even if they were, the idea of game engines being made available to anyone and everyone just wasn't common at this point. Ironically, it was in the same year of 1996 where Adobe Flash was released, which most would say was responsible for the first real boom of independent media being created, which was able to be pushed out to a massive audience online. Cawthon decided to use a piece of software known as ClickTeam, however, which you could arguably say was one of the most pivotal decisions in his entire career, as almost every game which he developed independently from that point on ended up using this very same software, with it being used in conjunction with a software called 3ds Max, which he used to create many of the graphics. In the forthcoming years, what we essentially see in terms of Cawthon's output is a mix between his video games, which are a completely solo effort, but interestingly, we also see other projects from him that purely revolve around animation. On the game side of things, you've got titles like Doofus, his very first, and as you can see, most basic and rough game he released. Coming into the 2000s, you had games like Legacy of Flan, a turn-based RPG that has you playing as several Flans, which you can customize and upgrade. This isn't the only turn-based game we'd see from him. In fact, we'll actually end up seeing several from Cawthon going all the way up to 2016, one of the most popular being Pilgrim's Progress, which was released in 2011. As you can see from the 3 examples I've just given, Cawthon's output naturally progressed with each sequential release. Doofus looks like a joke, as most first attempts at anything do. Legacy of Flan shows him tackling a completely different style of game, while simultaneously introducing a whole heap of new additions that make it feel a bit more fleshed out. Menu screens, an overworld where we can wander around and talk to other sprites, a combat system that provides a to and fro between you and the enemy. You may write these things off because of how standard they appear. Let's not mistake, although it is a huge step forward from what we saw with Doofus, it's undeniable that his game still looks like it was done by an amateur. But 1, that's because it was, and 2, that's ultimately irrelevant when looking at Cawthon's general progression, and one of the key improvements for me has to be the art style. Although the art direction in his games doesn't stick out to me in the same way as others do, Cawthon most definitely has a noticeable style to many of his games, which for me adds to the quite endearing quality that all of this is being created by one guy. And I'd say it's in his games Pilgrim's Progress as well as The Desolate Hope, where this art style gets refined to an extent where I become genuinely impressed. In regards to Pilgrim's Progress, this is where it should be said that Cawthon is a devout Christian, and although his later work may not particularly reflect that, a sizable portion of his earlier stuff most definitely does. As I said, in between his time creating games, he would also go on to create work with Hope Animations, creating short religious-based films revolved around subjects like Noah's Ark, as well as the Pilgrim's Progress allegory. And when it comes to the game, we've got even more to praise when it comes to Cawthon's further development. The backgrounds we see are surprisingly detailed. We get individual story moments that convey the narrative through text that comes up at the bottom, as well as seeing the characters' reactions play out with the several stills that show up above. And when it comes to the gameplay, we simply see even more experimentation. Cawthon appears to try his hand at all kinds of things here, which is great to be honest, as it shows he's still looking to learn, improve and develop on what he'd created previously. We do see the return of the turn-based combat, but in between those moments, we now have gameplay that's akin to a platformer, having to jump over holes that are present in the floor, while being able to collect coins which help us progress later on. For those of you who've seen Cawthon's later work as well, you should be able to see how some of the enemies we run into have designs which are quite similar to other foes we witness in future titles. And then when it comes to The Desolate Hope, I'd say this has to be one of Cawthon's most impressive games when it comes to the visuals. Not only do I think this game in particular serves as a massive point of influence when it comes to tackling his future titles, but there's a level of refinement to this one where I was starting to become consistently impressed, compared to simply looking on with a retrospective form of interest. There's key things we can witness in many of the environments here that remain distinct characteristics of Cawthon's games from here on out. The heavy emphasis on futuristic technology, with the many screens, panels and lights we see constantly flashing and flickering. There's also a huge focus on hyper-detailed elements which we can see in the foreground, foreground and background environments. While it can oftentimes feel overwhelming, that essentially adds to its success for me. There can be so much going on at points, but I'm rarely observing it as anything except a positive. In terms of the background scenery, you can see in some of these examples what I'm referring to. Huge metallic figures covered in all kinds of different parts, rooms covered in bright red robotic eyeballs that slowly blink, and a really strong adherence to these metallic wires that come in all kinds of different sizes and forms, which I'd argue could be the strongest visual detail we see carried across to his future games. While I wasn't all that impressed by the gameplay of Desolate Hope, this is one of the biggest leaps forward when it comes to Cawthon's creative output. A real identity is now starting to be carved out. I now know what a Scott Cawthon game looks like. But once again, it's that gameplay side of things that's debatably the weakest link. For the leaps and bounds he appears to make in the visual department, I still haven't connected with any of these games on a gameplay or story basis. There's loads of interesting ideas getting thrown out there, but that's kind of the point ultimately. I'd say the immense degree of experimentation is both the biggest strength and drawback so far. I'm consistently interested, but not truly engaged. This changes in a pretty massive way, however, when it comes to Cawthon's true breakout hit. It's a game that spawned a franchise which I've watched grow from essentially day one. And although I was expecting it to be big, I don't think I was expecting it to be anywhere near as successful as it would eventually become. And that's obviously the Five Nights at Freddy series, with the first game being released in 2014, only 2 years after Desolate Hope. Interestingly, however, the reason FNAF was even created in the first place actually relates to a game that was released the year prior, that being Cawthon's game Chipper & Sons Lumber Co. While the game itself doesn't appear too out of the ordinary compared to many of his other games, it's definitely lacking the same degree of polish as a game like Desolate Hope, for example. It's a point-and-click game where you wander around another mystical world, discovering all kinds of oddities while both planting and cutting down trees. As you progress, you're able to build things like lumber bots that automatically harvest wood for you. But yet again, there's not one sole mechanic being focused on here. While collecting wood and building new things might be the main feature of the game, you've still got all these external elements when traveling throughout the world, like the many different characters we can meet and the mini games we can get involved in, keeping things fresh while simultaneously making the experience feel more scrambled and confusing. As we've now established, experimentation is 100% a good and necessary part of creating something truly original. But like most things, if you don't balance this out with a solid concept which the player can attach to, you'll find their attention won't be held for very long. The most important takeaway, however, doesn't really stem from the game itself. It comes more from the feedback that Cawthon received upon releasing it. Generally, the response was quite poor, but it was particularly the art style and animations that came under heavy fire from those who played it. Unlike previous games that may have gotten away with these things because of their darker tones and heavy focus on robotics and technology, Chipper & Sons appeared to intentionally pare things down to a certain degree, as well as seemingly having kids be the target demographic. The criticisms, however, stem from the game appearing genuinely quite terrifying, and you can naturally see where these comments came from. Many of the creatures featured in the game are outright bizarre. For a game that I once again presume was aimed at kids, it's strange to see some of the background environments that would fit right in with Desolate Hope. The key piece of criticism in regards to the characters in the game, however, was that certain people were comparing their appearance and movements to that of an animatronic. For those who are unaware, animatronics are essentially mechanical puppets that have been designed in a way to move around on their own. And in American culture, many people tended to associate these with the eating establishment Chuck E. Cheese, a restaurant that was most well known for its cast of animatronic characters who'd perform songs on stage. Looking at any footage of these things, you can immediately identify why many children, and even adults, would be creeped out. Because they've purposely been designed in a way to make their movements look realistic, there's a strange uncanny nature to them that makes them feel a bit more sinister. You know they're not real, but you almost get this creeping feeling like they could break from their programming and do whatever they want. Not to mention, the designs of the Chuck E. Cheese crew don't look all that inviting either. As I say, there's something quite ominous when pairing up these actions which they appear to be performing on their own, with their blank expressions and wide open eyes. That's not to say everyone will be scared of these things, but it's quite similar to the fear of clowns that we've seen develop throughout the years. And with that being said, you can see how this kind of criticism being thrown towards Chipper & Co. not only makes sense, but also wouldn't have been intended. For Cawthon, this was starting to become a tough pill to swallow. As I mentioned, FNAF was his first proper success. Prior to that, his games weren't garnering anywhere near the same level of attention. Pair that up with his output being fairly relentless, and you've got a recipe for a great deal of burnout, and a doubtfulness in regards to having any of his games achieve success. During this time, Cawthon even started doubting his faith, and considered giving up on game development entirely. But Chipper & Co. serves as potentially one of the best examples I've seen of turning a negative into a positive. Taking criticism criticism for what it is and acting on it, compared to merely disregarding it. Most people take that route admittedly, thinking these criticisms are either objectively wrong and that these critics don't know what they're talking about, or outright ignoring it and continuing to do what they were already doing. It seems that although it may have initially hurt to see, however, Cawthon acted on this in a fantastic way. He'd already taken a step back from the heavy religious-based output after his crisis of faith, but after hearing words like terrifying, scary, and creepy be associated with one of his games, the idea sparked in his mind to go fully in that direction and create a video game that now intentionally attempts to unsettle and scare the player. There'd been elements that I'd say were intentionally creepy in his games before, but as we're about to see, what he was going to attempt to do with this new project was completely different to anything we'd seen before, and having experienced many of his previous games, Five Nights at Freddy's feels like a true lightning in a bottle moment. There's nothing prior in his catalogue which would indicate a game like this was coming, and equally, there's nothing I can truly pick out in his previous work which would tell me how well designed this game was going to be in numerous facets. Like most of his previous work, Five Nights at Freddy's was once again created using the ClickTeam Fusion engine and 3Ds Max, taking around 6 months to develop before eventually being released on de jure for PC. While the service is now dead, with the website now simply being reduced to a collection of Flash games after it was sold to several different companies, the de jure distribution platform was actually quite vital in giving independent developers the opportunity for their game to be seen. The reason it was created in the first place was because of how Steam, which both now and then remains the most popular game distribution service by far, only had its Greenlight service at the time for indie devs to use. Steam Greenlight was a flawed concept. While it gave some developers the chance to put out some genuinely quality content, it also led to a massive wave of dreadfully bad and lazy games which came along with it. The bad part for someone like Cawthon as well is that if you had no real interest in your games, and didn't want to go the route of setting up an army of bots to fill that role, your game simply wasn't greenlit. No matter how good or bad your game was, you needed to receive a certain number of votes for Steam to even consider adding your game to the platform. And needless to say, FNAF literally garnered no interest whatsoever, which must have felt like another kick in the teeth initially for Cawthon. This makes the story even more amazing to me, however. You've got a game that couldn't get onto Steam because nobody cared for the project, which then meant he had to resort to de jure. And although it was obviously a useful client for devs to use at the time, it was just nowhere close to Steam. You're putting your game out to a much smaller pool of players, although admittedly, it's a much nicher audience, who are likely always searching for diamonds in the rough. Compound that with the Kickstarter which Cawthon put up, which raised a grand total of $0, and all signs pointed towards this game being another failure. Getting into the game itself, however, I'd say that even from the opening title screen, it becomes clear that we're in for something a bit more special compared to the other games he created previously. For starters, the game opens up with a warning. This game contains flashing lights, loud noises, and lots of jump scares. For those who've played these games many times before, this will likely seem like nothing every time it pops up, but looking at it from the point of view of someone playing it for the very first time, this warning puts you on edge pretty much straight away, and this is something I think the first game arguably does better compared to every other one in the whole series. Even if this warning was put in purely as a way to inform the player of what they're getting into, it has the undeniable side effect of creating a great deal of suspense immediately. It's kind of like that Alfred Hitchcock bomb going off analogy. If you see a bomb go off in a film without any forewarning, you'll likely get a shock. But as there's no anticipation leading up to that moment, everything which came before it would appear rather ordinary. However, you inform the audience that a bomb's going to go off in 5 minutes while continually reinforcing how much time is left, and you immediately introduce a suspenseful anticipation to the exact same scene. This warning does exactly that. From this moment on, you're almost bracing yourself for the inevitable moment where you get jump scared. Although unlike that bomb example, I find it even more effective to have this come as a complete surprise compared to simply a countdown. Coming to the menu screen, while the way in which the menu itself is laid out seems about the same as all of Cawthon's other games, it's obviously the visuals which do a great job in building the suspense even further before the game's even started. Like most FNAF games, from the off, there's no options menu to configure, or extras for us to look at. We only get one real option to begin with, that being to start a new game. The two biggest takeaways from this screen, however, have to be the audio we hear in the back, as well as the titular Freddy Fazbear himself. Both of these elements are absolutely vital towards making the first game as scary as it is. The music, for starters, isn't too far off certain tracks I'd heard in some of Cawthon's previous work, but assuming you're going into the game with the context that we'll be dealing with sentient and dangerous animatronics, it essentially fits perfectly. A large part of the track is merely filled with several ambient drones that are layered on top of each other, but we also get multiple moments where these sharp electronic and metallic sounds are introduced, feeding into the idea of these animatronics breaking from their programming and going rogue. This pairs up incredibly well with the image of Freddy staring directly at us, with the heavy distortion and flashing light that illuminates only one side of his face, adding a level of mysteriousness to his character. And I'd say that equally applies to the brief snapshots we see of Freddy opening up his mouth, and even appearing entirely without his mask, exposing the sharp, metal insides of the suit, with the animatronics' glaring eyes and jagged edges, making for an even more unnerving image. Starting a new game, we're briefly shown a newspaper cutout that both sets up where this game's taking place, as well as what role we're serving in it. With the circle that's drawn around the advertisement, it seems that our characters applied for a job at a place called Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. The job itself will see him serving as a security guard, having to work during the night from 12 AM to 6 AM while monitoring the establishment. Keeping in line with Cawthon's silly style of humour that we've seen show up several times by this point, we can also see that for a job which on the surface seems rather simple and only gives out $120 a week, there's a condition right at the bottom of the job posting that clarifies they won't be responsible for any forms of injury or dismemberment that might be sustained during the job. And on top of that, you can also see when looking on the outer areas of the newspaper that much of the blurred text we can faintly see is the most obvious form of padding you can get, literally featuring phrases like blah 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 and this ad has nothing to do with anything relevant to the game. And ironically, although something like this blurred text is irrelevant to the actual experience, it's our first indication that much of Cawthon's unique charm isn't merely getting stripped away because of the darker and more serious tone. With all that being said, we're then finally brought to our first night on the job. And much like most games I look at with a strong degree of admiration, FNAF takes the approach of basically having the player learn how the game works for themselves, compared to holding their hand right from the off. We're not left completely without guidance, however, as after a few seconds, we end up getting a phone call from another security guard who previously worked in this position.
Hello? Hello? I wanted to record a message for you to help you get settled in on your first night. I actually worked in that office before you. I'm finishing up my last week now, as a matter of fact, so I know it can be a bit overwhelming, but I'm here to tell you there's nothing to worry about. You'll be fine. So let's just focus on getting you through your first week, okay? Let's see.
While he would eventually go on to be given a name many years down the line, fans at the time, and I'd assume still most people now, refer to this mystery man as simply Phone Guy. Hilariously, it's actually Cawthon himself who provides the voice work for this character. And I'll be honest, while I'm not gonna say it's the best performance I've heard in my life, I find the way in which he delivers his lines is undeniably memorable. Although Phone Guy does provide us with some genuinely useful tips, the way he talks always makes you feel like he's being disingenuous to a certain degree. The oftentimes stunted delivery we hear from this guy, leaving noticeable pauses between many of his lines, as well as several line deliveries that almost make him sound sarcastic, leaves us in a state of confusion. I have to assume Cawthon purposely performed in this manner to once again keep us on edge. When we hear him say things like this,
"But I'm here to tell you there's nothing to worry about. You'll be fine."
the manner in which he says it sounds so ridiculously unconvincing that it leaves a question in our minds as to if this guy's telling us the full truth, which as a result will also make us question any future advice he gives us and if it will truly help us out. Either way, I think his performance is great. The fact that he managed to make a random guy on a phone simply saying hello, hello somehow iconic says it all really. Although we never end up meeting this guy ourselves, the voice performance still stands out and sticks in people's minds. As for what he actually tells us during this brief message, after introducing himself, he reads out a short introductory greeting from the company. Much like the newspaper, the way in which this greeting is written out tries to disguise the horrors that actually await us here. In one sentence, we're being told about how the pizzeria is a magical place where fantasy and fun come to life. And in the next, we're back to talk revolving around injury or even death.
Welcome to Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, a magical place for kids and grown-ups alike, where fantasy and fun come to life. Fazbear Entertainment is not responsible for damage to property or person. Upon discovering that damage or death has occurred, a missing person report will be filed within 90 days or as soon as property and premises have been thoroughly cleaned and bleached and the carpets have been replaced. Blah, blah, blah. Now that might sound bad, I know, but there's really nothing to worry about.
This gives us an insight immediately that whatever's going on here, both the owners and the phone guy are aware of it, which makes it even more concerning that he merely shrugs it off with a blah blah blah. If you're paying close attention, you'll hear that in the event that we were to literally die here, which once again shouldn't really be a concern for merely a night watchman, we're told they won't launch any investigation. They'll instead file a missing persons report within a whopping 90 days, or instead file it after they've thoroughly cleaned the property and replaced the carpets. So we're getting an outright admission of covering up a death from this company. Again, very shady, but also quite hilarious when you consider this is what they're informing us about in their greeting message. And throughout the rest of Phone Guy's message, it's made infinitely clear what it is exactly that could potentially pose this potential cause of death we keep getting reminded of, and that's the animatronics. Phone Guy describes them as becoming a bit quirky at night, wandering around the establishment due to how they've been left on a free roaming mode, essentially allowing them to wander to any part of the pizzeria whenever they please. Adding to the disconcerting information that's continually been relayed to us, we're told that while this free roaming mode was also previously used during the daytime, an event referred to as the Bite of 87 caused them to stop using it.
They used to be allowed to walk around during the day too, but then there was the Bite of 87. Yeah. It's amazing that the human body can live without the frontal lobe, you know?
And from what Phone Guy mentions about how it's amazing a human body can live without a frontal lobe, it appears the animatronics were responsible for some kind of devastating incident in which they chomped on one of the visitors. This Bite of 87 is a pivotal part of the FNAF storyline that we'll see develop as the games go on. However, as I mentioned earlier, you would notice that the way in which this is conveyed is a bit more unconventional. You could imagine other games perhaps giving a greater deal of clarity on what this bite is, perhaps even cutting to some kind of flashback sequence where we see how the bite happened. And while we do get a bit more elaboration on these elements in future games, I feel the most important factor comes about in this first game, and that's putting the idea out there and simply having it linger in the background. It's not a coincidence that after FNAF started picking up some proper traction, fans immediately started questioning and theorizing about this Bite of 87. Much like everything featured in this game, all credit has to go to Cawthon. He definitely wouldn't have gone into this game thinking about future sequels and storylines that would unravel throughout several years. He throws out an idea, one that connected with the player base and sparked intrigue, and subsequently developed on that going forward. Some people try to fool themselves into thinking these things are planned out from day dot, but I arguably think that mindset takes away from the efforts of the creator. I'm not going to sit here and say the story and the manner in which it's conveyed is perfect, but to spark real intrigue in such a large amount of people with basically one offhand comment, I find it genuinely impressive. And going forward, these kinds of plot details need to be handled with a great deal of care and intelligence to make the storyline cohesive. This is where it should be said that for the vast majority of players, while the phone guy's speaking, they'll naturally start testing out all the gameplay mechanics that are on offer. And as you would have already been seeing, FNAF essentially boils down to a surprisingly simplistic point-and-click game, with an excellent concept lying at the core of it. It's important to note that we're literally confined to this one sole room. We can't get up from our seat and observe our office from a different angle, and we can't walk around anywhere else in the pizzeria. I bring this up as it's yet another point I really appreciate about this game. Despite being stuck in one room, with the fan in the center quite literally being the only part of it that doesn't remain static when not interacting with anything, the game still manages to remain genuinely creepy. And arguably, you might even have to attribute that to the fact that everything essentially takes place in this one room. Unlike other games, where you can go investigate things for yourself, we're made to sit here with the knowledge that something may or may not be happening, that something may or may not be lurking down one of the two corridors beside us. This is where the camera comes into play, however. You'll see at the bottom of our screen that there's a box with a downward pointing arrow, and upon hovering our cursor over it, we bring up our camera system, letting us tap into one of the 11 cameras that are scattered around the pizzeria. Now, while this mechanic may seem like it takes away from that unknown factor I just talked about when our camera's down, I believe it enhances it to a massive degree, and I'd say that primarily comes back to our inability to move. This is where several elements coalesce to raise the fear and suspense the player will be feeling, even during this first night where hardly anything substantial takes place. One of the last things we're told by Phone Guy is that we should keep an eye on the cameras and close the doors when only absolutely necessary, as if one of these guys gets into the room, they'll likely mistake us as an endoskeleton without a costume on and try stuff us into a suit, the endoskeleton being the metallic part contained inside the costumes. Because of how we can't move, we now know that once they're inside the room, there's no escape, we're 100% dead. And this is why the idea of the cameras works so well. We know what's going to happen to us, we know there's no escaping that, and the only way we can really go about preventing it is by watching our killers slowly creep towards us before stopping them at the very last second. That being said though, night 1 is by far the easiest night in the game, as you could probably assume. Although you'll likely start to see some movement from certain animatronics as the night goes on, perhaps even having one show up at your door, they shouldn't pose too much of a problem starting off. Heading into the second night, Phone Guy doesn't have as much to say this time, mainly because some of the most vital information was already conveyed in the previous night.
Hello? Hello?
This time, he starts going more into individual mechanics and animatronics, but once again, the manner in which this is handled simply gives the player an idea of what they should be looking out for. In no way is it spelling out how they should actually be playing. The main things would be how we're told that Freddy doesn't move that much, informing us that he'll likely make a more substantial appearance in the upcoming nights. We're also reminded of the importance of our door lights, as they may end up revealing an animatronic standing at our door. And finally, we're told about keeping an eye on Foxy, a character who most players likely won't see during their first night because of how they spend a large part of it with their camera open. We'll talk more about the individual animatronics and their roles in a second, but staying solely on the camera system for now, I think the way in which it's laid out and what we're able to actually witness is damn near perfect. When opening up the cameras for the first time, we're immediately placed on camera 1A. This camera not only happens to be the furthest away from us, landing right at the top of the camera layout, but it also happens to be located at the show stage, the area in which 3 of the animatronics always start off in. While it may seem quite irrelevant on the surface for those who are familiar with the game, I once again look at it from the point of view of someone playing for the first time, and in that regard, having this be the first thing they see teaches the player straight away that these are the threats you've been hearing about. This is where they start every night, but when looking to the layout in the bottom right, it also tells us they're as far away as they can possibly be to begin with. Not much can actually be seen on this camera apart from the animatronics. However, when looking to the dining area camera that's just beneath it, we start getting a greater idea of how this pizzeria actually looks. In the past, I've discussed the point of how budgetary limitations and careful resource management can oftentimes serve as a gateway to some of the greatest ideas coming to fruition, while the invention of things like CGI in films undeniably resulted in some excellent pieces of work getting created. We have to realise that it's the manner in which you utilise these tools which is the most important factor. If you've got a huge budget and can essentially do whatever you want on a project, there's a big chance that you'll always be taking the easiest option every single time. What's the point of investing so much time and effort into creating a practical effect when you can simply throw up a green screen and do everything digitally? And over time, we've ultimately seen exactly why this has done so much in the modern film industry, as with more people becoming specialised in this particular field, and the tools which they can utilise becoming even more fleshed out. It doesn't just save time now, but it's now oftentimes even more costly to do things practically. Now, relating this back to FNAF, what we're focusing on in this scenario, I'd assume has more to do with this time and budgetary side of things. As I said, this game was created in the span of only 6 months, and with the heavy output we saw from Cawthon in previous years, I'd likely say that many of his games were created in a time span even shorter than that. What separates this game from the rest, however, is that this is one of the first times I've perceived one of his games to be going fully in the direction of quality over quantity, even in a game like Desolate Hope, in which I am impressed by its visuals. Ultimately, I was disappointed when it came to the gameplay, as well as how many of the visuals we actually see don't blend particularly well with the background environments. This is where it needs to be said that despite the Click Team engine having the potential to work with certain 3D elements, it's predominantly used to create 2D games, and that's what the FNAF series is and remains as for most of the games in the series. This is why Cawthon's utilisation of 3D's max appears both impressive and rather ingenious. What you're looking at for the entire game is quite literally a collection of images that are strung together. When looking at the individual images in the game files, you can see things like the distortion effect we see on the camera systems and the main menu range from images 12 to 20. Think of it almost like stop motion. For every jump scare you see, and every effect you witness, these are all pre-rendered images that simply give the illusion that you're working in a 3-dimensional space, when in reality, everything is still being applied to a 2D plane. So coming back to this dining area for example, everything from the party hats to the chairs to the tables are all genuinely 3D models that were created in 3D's max. But the environment itself is not 3D, it's just a still 2-dimensional image. With that side of things out the way, however, we're once again able to see the strong influence that's been garnered from an establishment like Chuck E. Cheese, as when taking a look at any images of their interiors and how they're laid laid out, we're able to see some clear similarities. The vertical placement of the tables, the placement of this dining area being directly in front of the stage. And while not all of the restaurants I've seen have this, many also feature the same type of checkerboard style flooring, although from what I've seen it usually tends to be carpet. In the same room you've got Pirates Cove, which much like the show stage, doesn't actually appear to be showing anything of real note in terms of the environment, merely showing us a set of curtains with a sign telling us the stage is currently out of order. Although I will say, especially with the information we're given during night 2 that lets us know this is where Foxy resides, the way in which the curtain is just slightly ajar leads to a degree of suspense getting created once again, as we wait to see if and when Foxy will be peeking out of them. Most cameras outside the main part of the pizzeria are fairly standard. Camera 7 shows the restrooms, where we can see the iconic black and white floor tiling that covers most areas outside the dining area, another element that eventually goes on to serve as a memorable visual related to the FNAF series. Camera 3 shows a supply closet that breaks off from the left hallway, and the two hallways themselves don't feature much to observe either, outside of some posters and a set of rules on camera 4B, telling kids not to poop on the floor, not to scream, and not to touch Freddy. The two most interesting cameras of the lot would have to be cameras 5 and 6, the first of which shows a backstage area where we can see multiple versions of the same heads we see of the animatronics on stage. The most standout feature of this cam though has to be the metal endoskeleton that sits right in the foreground, ominously staring at the ground with its mouth being wide open as always. While the visual's good in itself, I mainly like how it perfectly sets up the game over screen which most players will inevitably run into, where as you can see, this same metal endoskeleton is eventually suited up in a Freddy Fazbear suit, with what we can assume is us stuffed inside when looking at the two human eyes that now pop out the large sockets. And when looking at camera 6, this one's more interesting because of what we don't see. For some reason, this one's entirely disabled, with us only being able to hear audio that's generated from what we're told is the kitchen. And while most of the time you'll simply hear nothing, this eventually changes when more of the animatronics start wandering around. The only thing I will say is that I'm not entirely sure what the purpose of this actually was, as although the idea of having certain cameras remain off sounds like an interesting concept on the surface, I've never found this creates too substantial of an effect when put in practice, primarily because in most scenarios, the animatronics still walk down the two adjacent corridors before reaching your room, which ultimately makes their disappearance from the cameras irrelevant, as you're not only made aware of exactly where they are by the sounds they generate, but can also get a visual on them once they leave the room. Looking at all the cameras collectively though, I think they achieve their goals very effectively in both a gameplay and atmospheric sense, even despite giving us a greater deal of clarity when it comes to what our environment actually looks like and where in the pizzeria these threats are located. There's still an air of mystery around each of these cameras. Like we're told in regards to using our door lights, we're still ultimately only getting a mere snapshot of what's going on. We're not able to actually observe this pizzeria in closer detail, and there's even several blind spots that we can't see whatsoever. Even when it comes to what we can see though, you've not only got some pretty creepy scenarios laid out already, like the backstage area, but I also have to praise elements like the distortion effect that's thrown up on screen, and the way in which all these areas are lit so dimly to where there's still an overwhelming sense of darkness to each and every scene. It's like I said with the image of Freddy on the main menu, a fear of the unknown and what lurks in the darkness can be equally as terrifying as a visual that's trying to be overtly unsettling, and it's another aspect that once again builds up the suspense even further, which let's not forget will make the final big jump scare feel like it's actually earned to a certain degree. The purposeful obscuration of each scene will have players almost doubting themselves, looking closer at each image to see if there's something hiding in the darkness. And when it comes to certain animatronics, this may also be necessary to an extent due to how well hidden some of their positions are. That ultimately links into the gameplay side of things, because as we were told during the first night, the more time we spend doing things like checking our cameras, the faster our power will drain. And on this gameplay front, I've pretty much got nothing but praise to throw towards this aspect either. We'll see when diving into how the animatronics function that we are able to see how elements like the game's replay value can be hampered. And while I'd pin this primarily down to the animatronics themselves, I do still believe there could have been more emphasis placed on the camera system outside of merely Foxy. You'll eventually see when it comes to some of the later nights that the only real use for the camera is in regards to consistently checking one single camera. Any time spent looking at other areas simply wastes power. And although I understand the vital role the power system plays when it comes to the frenetic balance the gameplay presents, I can't help but feel nights become more predictable as the game progresses, and the good work that's shown off when it comes to each camera and their multiple variations is somewhat wasted. That's arguably the only real issue I have though. I find the way in which everything is laid out to be fantastic, and that's mainly because of the relative simplicity when it comes to how the game's been designed. Cawthon follows a design principle that I strongly admire when it comes to any video game out there, and that's how every single camera has a set purpose. And naturally, that's why pairing it up with a simple and set concept works so well. If you don't broaden your your horizons to an extent that could be perceived as unattainable. The result can oftentimes lead to a game that appears carefully thought out and intelligently structured. And when it comes to these cameras, you would have likely heard from how I was initially describing them what role each of them serve. It's all obviously based around locating where each animatronic is, but there's a uniqueness which is developed in terms of which animatronics enter certain cameras and what routes they take towards your office. We'll discuss this more when looking at each individual animatronic, but looking solely at the design of the camera layout, this actually plays a large role when it comes to enhancing each animatronic's individual personalities and behaviours. The most vital ones are obviously the cameras which overlook Pirate Cove and the hallways, but I still like the inclusion of the ones that start to essentially become irrelevant the more you figure out how the game works. In my opinion, those will be cameras 3, 5, 6, and 7, which is primarily because they serve as mere pit stops for the animatronics, but even outside the brilliant visuals they provide, which already make the experience more enriching, it adds another level of complexity to the gameplay. Although they may not provide any real threat while standing in these rooms, it gives the player a greater opportunity to lose where they are. Newer players will already be trying to locate where each and every animatronic is to begin with. Having more cameras in the pizzeria draws out that process, and as a result, you could find yourself in a situation where you're either running out of power too quickly, or lose track of them entirely and get jump scared. So the camera system, brilliant in a visual and gameplay sense. My only real criticism stems from the slight amount of confusion the player can be met with when multiple animatronics are in the same room as each other. Because we're working purely with static images, and these aren't actually 3D models wandering around a 3D environment, FNAF falters a bit when it comes to the variation in some of these images. For example, if Freddy and Chica find themselves standing in the restrooms camera, it's only Chica that will show up on the cameras. This not only serves as a problem when it comes to identifying where all the animatronics are, but may also trick the player into thinking Freddy's actually moved, when realistically he's still there, but is merely not being shown because another image is now placed on screen. In terms of the game's look, I see the style of the entire FNAF series essentially getting set from this very first entry. That's how distinct and considered I perceive the look of this game to be. And I'm talking about everything from your office, to the different rooms, to the animatronics. And as I've just discussed, there's not many things I can pick out as being all that flawed when observing purely this camera system. The dynamic it creates when it comes to the animatronics and the power system is excellent, providing gameplay that always keeps you on edge because of several different factors that could result in your demise. And even when it comes down to the more basic facets, like the map we use in the bottom right to actually switch between each of the cameras, while appearing simplistic, it does its job perfectly. Never am I sat thinking the map's taking up too much space, and equally, I'm never sat thinking these boxes are too small and finicky to interact with. All things in regards to the camera system are pulled off just about as well as I can imagine. Night 3, of course, begins with another phone call, this one being the briefest of the lot so far, not giving us any real information that will help us out during the night, but instead saying that in the scenario one of these animatronics gets in our room, we should perhaps try playing dead, something we obviously can't do in-game due to how we're met with an immediate game over screen.
Hey listen, I had an idea. If you happen to get caught and want to avoid getting stuffed into a Freddy suit, try playing dead. You know, go limp. Then there's a chance that maybe they'll think that you're an empty costume instead.
I think it's time we talked about those animatronics, however, as with them being the one and only true threat in the game, perhaps with the exception of the power meter, this is another factor that would have had to be achieved effectively to really create a substantial degree of tension. First off, it has to be said that much like many other elements of the game's style, I find their designs to be absolutely fantastic. We've got 4 of these to deal with during our 5 nights here. Freddy Fazbear, who's the leader of the group, sporting a small top hat and bow tie while holding a microphone. You've then got Bonnie the Rabbit, who wears a red bow tie, as well as holding a guitar in his hand, Chica the Chicken, who holds a cupcake, and Foxy the Pirate, who when he eventually peeks out of Pirate Cove is mainly characterized by the state of disrepair he finds himself in. Unlike all the others, Foxy's suit is torn to shreds, seeing the inner endoskeleton prominently exposed in areas like his hands and legs. What do you notice about each of these guys and how I've described them? Every single one has unique traits which only apply to them and them alone. Freddy's microphone, Bonnie's guitar, Chica's cupcake. All these things already go a long way in distinguishing each character. You've then got aspects like the distinct colours that are shared between all of them. Brown, purple, yellow, and a more reddish brown when it comes to Foxy. The most standout colours obviously come from Bonnie and Chica, with the other two resembling how their real-life animal counterparts appear a bit more closely. Colour is one of the most important factors when it comes to making visuals stand out, and I believe all the animatronics excel in that department as well. But then you've got aspects which are shared between all of them that give the animatronics as a whole a more defined identity. Their mouths, which oftentimes appear agape, the wide open eyes that always seem to be staring directly at us, the endoskeleton we can see both inside their mouths but also in several gaps that are present along their arms and legs. I can easily see why these characters would eventually go on to be sold as genuine toys in real life, because what Cawthon essentially does in terms of purely their designs is perfectly capture that same kind of creepiness garnered from animatronics we've seen before, and just like in that instance, some will be freaked out and others won't see anything wrong. When it comes to FNAF, the horror for some won't stem from the animatronics' appearances, it'll be more related to their motivations and how they actually act. On the whole though, I think they're an excellent cast of characters. You can definitely see Cawthon's unique style shine through with every single one of these guys, and I think it's no mistake that players attach to them almost immediately, as although they do admittedly still appear quite sinister, there's also a level of charm to their designs, which makes them a more unique threat compared to any kind of standard robotic villain we've seen many times before. Looking at how they actually function throughout each night, however, this is where things start to become a lot more interesting. As you could probably assume, with each sequential night we enter, things start getting gradually more difficult. The way in which these guys act during night 3, for example, will be a whole lot more aggressive and direct compared to what we experienced during night 1. However, it's not as simple as just raising the difficulty of them all with each new night. It's actually a whole lot more dynamic than that. Once again, let's use night 1 as the baseline example, as it arguably showcases how each night progresses the best out of all of them. Essentially, each individual animatronic has a separate level that it can be set to, ranging from 0 to 20. These levels can vary significantly when it comes to two factors, and those are what night you're on, but also what time you're on during the night. Starting off in night 1 at 12 AM, all of the animatronics are set to 0. They're basically incapable of doing anything, and have next to no chance to land anywhere close to your office, let alone jump scare you. This is great to begin with obviously, as it gives players the chance to actually take in as much information as possible, whether it be through listening to the phone guy or observing the pizzeria through their cameras. As the night progresses however, these levels rise when it comes to 3 of the animatronics, those being Bonnie, Chica and Foxy. We could have already assumed this really, due to phone guy's mention of how Freddy rarely comes off stage, but even when it comes to the ones who get their level raised, it's actually Bonnie who has the most substantial increase. This is down to the fact that when the first point increase occurs, that being at 2 AM for all nights bar for night 3, it only affects Bonnie, with the next 2 hours then going on to additionally add points to Chica and Foxy alongside him. So no matter what the AI values are when going into the night, you always tend to find characters like Bonnie will create some kind of impact, even during night 1. These AI values make all the characters more aggressive, so essentially the higher the value, the more you'll see Chica and Bonnie show up at your doors, and the routes they take to reach your office will oftentimes be far more direct. And while there is still a random factor when it comes to all this stuff, you're never usually going to see these animatronics taking the exact same routes, and reaching your office at the exact same times on multiple playthroughs. Certain nights are also purposely designed to give you a more substantial test in regards to particular animatronics. Night 3 is a good example of this, as from the very start, Chica is set to level 5, while Bonnie's set to 0 and Foxy's set to only 2. I always felt that Chica was the most prominent animatronic during night 3, but never knew this was actually by design. Upon discovering this, however, I'd have to say that I was even more impressed by how each night was designed. Before learning about the increasing AI values, I always just assumed each night was mainly just about increasing difficulty across the board. But night 3 encapsulates another design philosophy which I really love, and that's how Cawthon's once again taking full advantage of what he's putting on the table. While you could say it makes the nights more predictable, potentially killing off replay value, that point remains somewhat irrelevant to me in this instance because of the intentionality of these kinds of decisions. It's keeping the experience continually fresh. While you may have gotten used to mainly dealing with Bonnie in the previous nights, now you're made to take on Chica, which let's not forget could lead to some real problems cropping up if you've gotten too used to checking on the cameras that Bonnie merely adheres to. That brings us to an even greater point however, and that's the dynamic that I was alluding to previously that's shared between the animatronics and the cameras. Cameras 1A and 1B are essentially two meeting points. You look at 1A to see immediately which animatronics have left the stage and which ones remain. Once they're off the stage, none of them return, so 1B is then used almost as a hub which they oftentimes return to. When I say they, I'm obviously referring mainly to Bonnie and Chica, as Freddy typically only starts moving around from night 4, and Foxy works differently to all of them. As I mentioned though, the manner in which they make their way to your office isn't conventional. They don't go from one spot to another on a set path which they follow every time, as obviously that would make their eventual appearances at your door incredibly predictable. That's why those external pit stops are so important, as when Bonnie heads into the backstage area or Chica heads to the bathrooms, there's not only a brief sense of relief the player may feel considering how far away they are from their position, but at the same time, if you get too comfortable, this could ultimately come back to bite you in the event that you aren't keeping a close enough eye on them. Now when it comes to some of the later nights, there are points where these guys basically make a beeline directly to your office. But especially in the earlier ones, you're given a great opportunity to merely watch them wander around for a while and observe their behaviour. Once again, a great way to let players learn the mechanics of the game while not punishing them too heavily if they fail in their efforts. This is the period where you're able to actually identify things like which rooms only Chica enters and which ones only Bonnie enters, and their general routes, while being another aspect that you'd have to describe as simplistic, as they only come from one of two pathways, is exactly what makes it great. In no way would I describe this game as being outright easy. With each progressing night, if you aren't noticing the patterns of these animatronics and recognizing what each of them do and where they go, you will end up getting jump scared. The way in which they travel around and actually appear on the cameras though is yet another great facet I've always appreciated about this game. While it can appear a bit unrealistic at points with how they can start hopping all over the place in a fairly rapid manner, at no point would I ever say their behaviours were ever truly unfair. There can sometimes be a degree of luck involved in beating the particularly difficult nights, but I'd say that's more in regards to managing your power while keeping an eye on Foxy. In terms of the characters that gradually approach our doors, I find that much like their distinct appearances, their movement ingeniously adds even more to their personality. For those who've played the game before, the fact that Bonnie and Chica always go down their separate sides becomes a standout part of how they behave, and as a result, you could even say that individual rooms they enter are given even more personality because of that association. It should also be said that the way in which the animatronics appear within these scenes helps that side of things immensely as well. This is where the real sinisterness can be felt from these guys, oftentimes glaring directly into the cameras, seeming to be aware that we're actively watching them. And the further we get into the game, we even start seeing strange oddities, like how Bonnie and Chica start glitching out when standing beside our office. There's even some other more unique and rare positions we can find them in that are honestly quite terrifying, but we'll get into them more when discovering the other strange occurrences we can witness in this game. One thing I've only briefly touched on up to this point, however, is how each animatronic actually behaves. We now understand that all of them become more aggressive whenever their AI levels increase, and you could pretty much gather from my description of Bonnie and Chica that they mainly just wander around before appearing at your doors. It's Freddy, and more importantly, Foxy, who provide a more unique approach towards getting in your office and murdering you. These two are essential towards creating a brilliant dynamic that's shared between them and the more outwardly offensive animatronics in Bonnie and Chica. As I've described, those two are about as direct as you can imagine. Once you see them coming down the two hallways, it's likely only a matter of time before they show up at your doors. In a way, your survival's less dependent on what actions you're actually taking. Observing them on the cameras is basically just a form of recon. No matter whether you're looking at them, flashing your lights, or shutting your doors, there's nothing you can do to deter them from whatever room they want to enter and how quickly they want to stand outside your office. The light and door buttons are the only way of tackling these two. Once you're unable to locate them on your cameras, it's a good idea to flash both lights, as there's a good chance they'll likely be waiting outside. Naturally, if they appear once you've done this, most people will immediately shut the door, and if achieved successfully, they'll continue to wait outside for a while until eventually wandering away again. If you fail to close the door in time, however, you'll notice that both buttons will stop working. But you won't actually get jump scared until you pull up your camera, so you may initially assume you'll be able to just wait things out until the night's over. But this is where Foxy comes into play. Foxy's quite a bit different to how Bonnie and Chica function, as he's almost the exact opposite to them in terms of what it takes for him to come after you. Foxy is entirely reliant on you looking away from your camera, as this is the only way in which he begins to peek out of Pirate Cove. Even with his AI level cranked up to the max, he will not start leaving his stage unless you have your camera down for a period of time. Foxy has 3 different stages once he's active. The first merely shows him peeking out of the curtain, the second is when he's fully emerged from it, and then a final stage where the curtain's entirely open and Foxy's nowhere to be seen. That's where you have to close your door as fast as possible, as after a very short amount of time, or by simply switching over to the left hallway, Foxy will dash into the room and kill us. You can't let this happen too frequently, however, as after the first time Foxy bangs on your door, but each subsequent time will result in him draining more and more of your power. The other interesting detail about how he functions obviously stems from the movement that we're actually able to witness. Whereas all the other animatronics remain completely static when looking on the cameras, Foxy's the only one who we actually see move. Anyways, his AI level's basically all centered around that aspect. The higher the level, the more you're having to keep an eye on him, and as you could assume from all the other factors we're having to pay attention to, that's where the gameplay starts developing a good deal of depth. We've got a foe who requires us to look at our cameras, paired up with a power system that actively punishes us for using our camera for too long, and then that's paired up with the other foes who act how they want in spite of what what we're doing, and actively drain even more of our power when coming to our doors. The way in which all this links together is brilliant. Once again, some real considered and smart design choices that has the player continually balancing out their actions throughout the night, having to be proactive by checking on Foxy, while simultaneously having to sit back at points due to the concerns in regards to our power. Really excellent stuff, but again, I wouldn't say the idea in itself is all that complex. It's exactly what I just described it as, a pairing of proactive and reactive gameplay, and one that I imagine will initially result in plenty of jump scares before the player eventually gets a grip on how to appropriately handle all these situations. And then of course you've got Freddy, the character who remains absent for the vast majority of the game, before eventually making his way towards your office in the closing nights. Freddy's arguably the most mysterious of the bunch, as unlike Foxy, we're never really told what he does and how we can prevent him from getting in the office. He's similar to Foxy in that we're actually able to stop him moving by keeping an eye on him. However, unlike Foxy, who can merely be stopped by having your camera open, you actually need to be watching the exact camera Freddy's on to have a chance of slowing his movement. I'd say he's more similar to Bonnie and Chica, however unlike them, Freddy's movements are pre-planned, always heading down the same path as Chica on the right hand side, with him only ever progressing forward until he reaches your office. And unlike the other two, once he actually reaches the final camera, that being 4B, he'll never appear in the doorway when flashing your light. The way in which he can get into your room all depends on your camera once again, as in most cases, once he's gotten this close, you must close your right door before opening up your camera, as due to the fact he never actually shows up at your door in the same way Bonnie and Chica do, his next movement will take him directly into your room, resulting in your death obviously. So Freddy's kind of like a hybrid between all of the animatronics in the game, and is easily the one with the most amount of mystery surrounding him in regards to how the player actually deals with him. But even when he does start introducing himself during your playthrough, he doesn't throw off the balance of the overall experience. Even when things start getting really tough, I still stand by the fact that the game is mostly fair when it comes to how you can deal with all these threats. On the whole though, the animatronics and their individual behaviours has to be described as another part of the game that I think is handled very well. As I say, although Bonnie and Chica are most definitely still threats that can easily catch you off guard if you aren't aware of your surroundings and checking your doors, Foxy and Freddy are the ones that bring everything together. It's the dynamic between these two threats who do what they want regardless of what you're doing, and the other two that can actually be affected by us when checking our camera. When put in practice, you're going to be put in situations that can feel unbelievably tense, knowing that Foxy's about to come bursting through your door, but not being able to check the camera because your power's about to die and Bonnie's waiting right outside. And with the rising difficulty we witness as the game goes on, what may have appeared as an experience that some might actually say was boring because of how you're sat in one room with hardly anything going on for the first couple nights, soon becomes one where you're frantically scrabbling around as you find yourself constantly on the brink of dying. At the start of night 4, we end up receiving the most bizarre phone call of all the ones we've gotten so far. Unlike before, where Phone Guy attempts to give us some advice regarding the animatronics that are heading our way, this one instead shows him in a state of absolute panic, as it seems like he's in the process of getting caught himself.
Hey, do me a favor. Maybe sometime you could check inside those suits in the back room. I'm gonna try to hold out until someone checks. Maybe it won't be so bad. Yeah, I always wondered what was in all those empty heads back there. You know. Oh no.
In the previous two nights, we've been focusing more on how this game sets up its scares from mainly a functional point of view, but we obviously can't forget about the atmosphere side of things either. I brought this up briefly when looking at all the different environments in the pizzeria, and if we're talking about the game's visuals, Cawthon follows the great idea of essentially making this place look as realistic as possible. Those of you who've actually been to places like Chuck E. Cheese will obviously have more insight on this, but from everything I've seen online, FNAF decides to not differ from that concept, and go in some wacky, mystical direction, something that Cawthon's done during many of his other games. The environment feels believable, the outlandish part of the game is the sentient animatronics, but that's exactly why I perceive the setup of this game to be so frightening. In my opinion, you have to have that aspect of normality to everything, so it can then enhance when we start seeing things totally out of the ordinary. It's another case of throwing the player off balance and keeping them on their toes. What initially seems like a normal night sat in a room checking on cameras immediately becomes a nightmare when the animatronics start moving around. So as I said, all the environment environments we witness on our cameras do a great job in fleshing out the location while still remaining in one room. But this one room in itself is also designed excellently, and in my opinion was the most important location in the whole game to get right, as ultimately you're going to spend a lot of your time playing just staring at this one screen. First off, I have to once again appreciate the fact that what we're looking at here is simply a 2D image. While I always thought the three-dimensional look was pulled off really effectively, all you have to do is look online and see tons of people questioning if the game is actually 2D or 3D, to essentially confirm that Cawthon was definitely successful in terms of how he wanted the game to look. Because we spend so much time in this office, many items in here naturally started resonating with the fanbase, which as a result ended up with many of them also becoming a staple that we'd see crop up in many of the future entries. Things like the fan, which serves as the only moving element of our office when not interacting with anything, the cupcake that sits on top of the monitors staring at us, and of course the Celebrate poster featuring Freddy, Bonnie and Chica, which as many of you will know gives us a small piece of feedback whenever we click on Freddy's nose. But there's other great stuff here that I don't think gets talked about anywhere near as much. These would be things like the children's drawings that are hung up on the walls, some of which not only show off what would be occurring during the daytime with how it seems the kids are given gifts by these animatronics, but others also being outright creepy, primarily ones like the drawing which shows Bonnie emerging out of a present with hollow black eye sockets and two small yellow eyes. When thinking about elements like these more deeply, we can then start drawing connections to details like that bite of 87 which was mentioned during the first night, and start thinking about things like what that bite actually was, who it was inflicted on, and why it happened in the first place. It should be said as well that our view of the hallways outside is another part of our office that's perfect when it comes to amping up the horror. One small nitpick when moving back and forth between the two doors is that it does start to become a bit more obvious that we're merely watching an image, as if you look on the far left or right hand sides, you'll see how the image starts noticeably contorting and appearing curved, but that's not too big of a deal realistically. The doors themselves are great though, with the hallway appearing like a pitch black void when the lights are turned off, giving you no indication whatsoever as to if something's standing outside. But then when interacting with either of the two buttons, we get this brilliant feeling of both fear and safety at the same time. When turning on your light, for example, we're illuminating the hallway and killing off that fear of the unknown. But equally, if something does happen to be standing at our doorway, we're in for a bit of a shock. And with the doors, when closing one of these, the manner in which they shut and the strong metal material they appear to be made out of, it gives us a feeling of relief whenever we bring them down. However, much like when we flash our lights, you've also got the concern of how long these are actually remaining down for, as the longer one of these animatronics stands at your doorway, the more you're going to start worrying about how much power's getting used. The power meter, much like all the UI elements in this game, is conveyed in a manner that's straight to the point, informing the player of what's going on at all times in a very clear manner. While we'll eventually see future entries lose their way slightly, with the UI becoming way too cluttered, this first game's interface is minimalist and tells you just about everything you need to know. The time in the top right obviously indicates how long we've got left, and I love the choice to only show that hour compared to showing how many minutes we've got left until we progress to the next one, as it can present a brilliant feeling of anticipation and anxiousness in certain scenarios. Say you're starting to run low on power and are only on 4 AM, you're going to find yourself desperately checking on the time, hoping that it's about to switch over to 5, simply so you can have a chance of surviving the night. In relation to that, you obviously don't have that effect if we don't have the power and usage elements in the bottom left. Once again, small enough to not clutter the image, but still easily noticeable on screen. While the power meter simply tells us what % our power's on, the usage meter is a far more important tool when merely starting off. Once you know that the camera, lights and doors use up power, you're naturally going to start using them as infrequently as possible. But as you can see, when using all these things, the usage meter will start rising from green to orange and finally to red. As I said, simply an indication of how much power you're using, and almost a warning that if you continue to use it to this extent, you're going to run out fairly quickly. It should be said as well, in the event the player does run out of power, the way in which we close out the night can be hilariously evil. Essentially, once everything shuts off, RNG plays a big factor in how long it will take for you to actually die. This is because, unlike other jump scares, this one's drawn out to give the player a chance of surviving the night. So if the power ran out as you're halfway through 5 AM for example, there's a possibility that you'll still be able to reach 6 AM. The reason I find it so evil though is what we're made to witness. First, when the power shuts off, we're left in complete darkness and almost total silence. Then, in the left hallway, Freddy then makes an appearance, with him playing the same Toreador march song that he plays in the kitchen, and having lights flash from his eyes and mouth. And after he eventually stops, we're brought to absolute darkness yet again, while being able to hear him slowly walk towards us. All stuff that ends up creating an immense amount of fear, less from the jump scare that we know is inevitably coming, but more in relation to our potential victory appearing so close, which in some cases can also lead to a huge feeling of relief in the event that you do manage to reach 6 AM while all this plays out. We can't forget though, there's one component that contributes to both of these elements that plays a big part in achieving their desired effects, and that's the audio we're hearing. I've heard many horror creators in the past describe audio as being just as, if not even more important compared to what the audience is saying, and I concur with that wholeheartedly. If the soundtrack isn't up to scratch and doesn't fit with the images you're shown on screen, you can be ripped straight out of the experience, and thus removing much of the horror from it. The two elements I just referred to in the light and door buttons are two great examples of this. That short feeling of genuine safety when slamming the door down is enhanced significantly when hearing the swift and weighty sound effect that accompanies it. And same goes for when we spot one of the animatronics in our doorway. It's basically an alert sound that will both give the player a small fright, on top of reinforcing how they need to shut that door immediately. I think the audio is superb in all fronts, however, with one of my favourite elements of the entire game stemming from the stark ambience we're constantly hearing in the back. I think this first game has one of the best soundtracks in the series, and I'd say only a couple future entries even come close to recapturing anything similar. The overwhelming, almost suffocating drone that constantly plays in the back, the sharp sound of the fan, which always seems to cut through, the brief audio snippets we hear throughout the night of certain playful jingles, and Foxy singing in Pirate Cove. The ambience is outright phenomenal, and for me, is one of the most important factors towards building that ever-increasing suspense. Equally though, much like the lights I talked about, audio also plays a vital role when it comes to the gameplay as well. While you may not initially realise it, if you pay attention to the audio in the background instead of flicking between the cameras constantly, you're able to gather a faint idea of what the animatronics are doing without even pulling up your camera in the first place. Essentially, every time one of these guys moves into a different room, you'll hear the sound of footsteps. And although these don't particularly indicate where in the pizzeria they're located, you at least are made aware that they're on the move, and that they could even potentially be standing by your door. Naturally, once you become aware of this, you can start relying less on finding them on the cameras, and instead take the riskier, albeit beneficial approach of purely relying on the sound of these footsteps, and your lights to save some more power. However, there's also other sound cues relating to even more specific actions from some of these guys, which are actually even more helpful. These would relate to things like the sounds of either pots and pans getting thrown around, or Freddy's Toreador March theme, both of which indicate that either Chica or Freddy have found themselves in the kitchen area. And you've also got Freddy's laugh, which lets us know when he's on the move. All things that will genuinely help the player on some of the particularly tough nights, due to how they give a clear indication as to what's going on, while not diverting your attention away from the other actions you're also focusing on. When talking about sound in the FNAF games, however, it's impossible to ignore the loudest and most notorious sound of all, the jump scares. This is a part of the game that FNAF is basically defined by. For everything I've said about the brilliant atmosphere that's generated from all the sounds we're hearing and the unique visuals that are created, the ultimate culmination to all this setup is a deafeningly loud noise, and having one of the animatronics freaking out in front of you. When it comes to the criticism that's thrown at the FNAF games, I'd have to assume this plays a pretty significant role in why many people either dislike or write off even trying the series. Don't get me wrong, I feel the fact that young kids got interested in the series later on also plays quite a big factor, because as we've seen in cases like Fortnite for example, the fact that children show an interest in these games is oftentimes brought up in a manner to demean them, to tell others they shouldn't be taken seriously. And while I completely disagree with that side of things, I can totally understand why someone would be turned off by the jump scares in this game. In my case, I quite literally have grown up with these games, and when playing them as a kid, I found the jump scares absolutely terrifying. Many years have passed since then, and you'll tend to find that as you grow older and experience these kinds kind of startling jump scares in many different pieces of media, the effect eventually wears thin. When returning to the game, that's why I was almost taken aback by how excellent the build-up to these jump scares actually were, because from the outside looking in, I'd say most people look at the franchise and merely think jump scares are the only form of horror that's created, and that's not the case whatsoever. And looking at all of them, while I don't take any real issue with them, they do unfortunately end up suffering from that very same effect of having the fear factor wear off the more you play. The atmosphere still remains a component I enjoy regardless of if I'm feeling scared or not, but because of the sheer extremity of the jump scares, as well as having their only function be related to making you startled, the more you experience them, the more their ultimate effect will be diminished. And worse of all, depending on factors like how often you're seeing these and at which point in the night they occur, they can actually start developing the effect of annoying and frustrating the player, which is definitely not the emotion that would be intended. I can't criticize it too much, as it's not something that's unique to FNAF in particular. I've already said how horror can oftentimes be a much more visceral media experience that plays off your emotions by unsettling you, which is why it's so important that outside the scares, you aren't skimping on the other parts of your project that would make someone recognize it as quality. Because once those scares wear off, and they will, if you've got nothing else to offer, there's no need for anyone to ever think of or even experience your work again. Now, I've obviously only talked about the actual effects that's trying to be achieved so far, because at the end of the day, that's the most important factor when it comes to a jump scare. But just in terms of how these are actually pulled off in-game, while the loud scream and abrasive visual that's presented could very much be more annoying to some players compared to being scary, from the animation and sound point of view, I think they're pretty good. The scream itself is merely a sample taken from a film called Inseminoid, being heard during a scene where a woman's giving birth to an alien baby. Definitely startling, and the clear manipulation of the sample from Cawthon makes it even more distinct. I think there's a deferral of expectations that makes the sound even more shocking when thinking about how other horror-related threats sound in other games and films. You tend to find the noises that are generated from many threats sound totally bizarre and alien, and alongside that, it's not uncommon for these sounds to actually be a bit deeper, to increase their sense of dominance and upping the fear factor once again. The screams all these guys let out though, all of which are identical I should add, are more bizarre because of the similarity we can actually garner. The scream they let out doesn't sound alien whatsoever. You could say it sounds quite robotic, but even then, to me, there's still a human quality there, and as we start looking deeper into the game's stories, we'll start to see how that may have been a fully intentional decision from Cawthon once again. The sound will obviously be the key factor towards making the player jump. If you pulled the camera down and just saw them doing this in front of you, it would actually appear straight up ridiculous. But as we are given this startling sound alongside these animations, I'd say most of them appear relatively fine and actively enhance the scares. I say most, because while I enjoy scares like the ones we get from Chica, Bonnie and Freddy, there's some others which are slightly more underwhelming. The whole reason those first three work is down to how close they are when pulling your camera down. Not only are our senses getting scrambled by the overwhelming noise penetrating our ears, we've also got this unavoidable and frenzied visual filling up almost our entire screen. When it comes to Foxy's jump scare, for example, or Freddy's one when the power shuts off, these are not only far too expected already, considering you'll know in most cases that a jump scare is about to occur, but they're lacking that same claustrophobia scene with the previous ones I mentioned. Foxy literally just sticks his head through the doorway, and Freddy appears further away before launching closer in. So all in all, do these jump scares particularly scare me anymore? Well, it's hit and miss for me personally. The main times I'm thrown off and actually scared by these are when I'm fully engrossed in the scenario because of that atmosphere and build-up I experienced prior to it, and because I feel those two components are so strong with this first game, I am still finding myself getting startled occasionally, even all these years later. Nowhere near the level as when I first played the game, but I find that a pretty unrealistic goal for any piece of horror media to achieve anyways. But outside of that, I do have to say, the way in which the majority of these have been implemented still provides a level of quality. I think most of the animations of them screaming in our face look great, and the audio which accompanies them, while being quite repetitive, is undeniably another iconic element that you can directly associate with FNAF whenever and wherever it's played. The voicemail we hear in Night 5 is the most twisted of them all. With Phone Guy presumably dead, it's not clear who even left this message, while the audio itself is interspersed with the same sounds we hear when getting jump scared. It's also unclear who or what is actually generating these sounds. But in terms of how it sets us up for this final night, that relatively friendly, but albeit disingenuous voice we've been hearing throughout the game is gone. Although in reality, this is basically an indication that we've now learned everything we need to progress to the end of the game. That feeling of being stranded gets enhanced even more. There's no potential comfort we can acquire from listening to another human voice giving us tips. We're now completely on our own. And with this night being the toughest we experienced so far, with characters like Freddy now starting to become significantly more active, it does a good job in ramping up the stressful nature that essentially defines how the game played out from the very start. And talking of all this, I think it's time we start looking at an aspect of this game, and the series overall, that's easily resulted in the most amount of talk being generated from the fanbase, and that's the storyline. Now, as I mentioned before, the FNAF games tell their story in just about the most unconventional way possible. Much like a series like Dark Souls does, FNAF predominantly works on the idea of lore to convey its story. But even then, Dark Souls at least has the benefit of featuring actual cutscenes and dialogue, which flesh out the world to an extent where someone interacting with them will at least grasp a general concept of what's going on. With FNAF, all those kinds of elements like the newspaper clipping at the start or the messages left by Phone Guy hardly have anything to do with the actual story that's developing in the background. All they do is introduce the concept of us being a security guard for a pizza place, and it's only really in our brief talks with Phone Guy where certain details start getting alluded to. What I've just mentioned is a pretty massive reason as to why there was so much intrigue revolved around the game's story. Ultimately, you could go through every single night in the game and be none the wiser as to how this game goes any deeper than simply being about killer animatronics coming to kill you. The discovery of the actual storyline rests on two things, and that's the player themselves and essentially getting lucky once again. What you see is what you truly get with this first game. There's no secret mini games we can access or secret codes we can enter to unlock a special ending. It's purely a matter of looking at our cameras and paying close enough attention to notice that something has now potentially changed. Now there's two things I like about this, and that's how this approach would have led to both an immense degree of theorizing before these story details were actually found, but also even after they were discovered. It left fans questioning what all these things mean, and resulted in people searching even deeper to see if there was anything else to garner. If you think about it, that scenario I mentioned of reaching the end of the game and being none the wiser is likely what most people's first experience of this game actually was. But just because no real narrative had revealed itself to the player, it didn't mean there was no interest in finding one. The first example that pops in my mind would be how the Call of Duty Zombies storyline gradually developed throughout the years. Although we'd eventually get all our questions answered in future releases, it was the sheer fact that people were asking questions in the first place that essentially gave them the opportunity to tell that story. People who theorize in these early stages are more than likely going to be incorrect when looking at the grand scheme of things, but that's ultimately irrelevant. We already said how there's next to no chance Cawthon would have had the entire story planned out from day one. The real benefit of telling a story in this way, so long as the rest of the game sparks a similar amount of intrigue in the player base, is that it ends up resulting in the game essentially marketing itself. This is a huge part of why FNAF created such a massive boom upon being discovered by content creators. Those watching the game were already interested in the world that Cawthon had created, and because he included so many mysterious elements and open-ended plot threads, you had the likes of MatPat with his incredibly popular game theory show constantly making videos in relation to the series. So much attention was being drawn to the game from a component that I'm sure even Cawthon himself would admit was nowhere near fleshed out. People were asking questions and coming up with answers that didn't even exist yet. So to start off with, while he could have gone with the usual approach and focused on telling his narrative through text boxes and short story sequences, Cawthon cleverly takes a step back for the most part, leaving players to come up with their own interpretation of what's going on. With all that being said, we aren't left with nothing to ponder on. There are some actual story details sprinkled in, which eventually set up what the series will mostly focus on for the endurance of it, and the way in which we discover these links back to those oddities I referred to earlier on that can randomly show up when looking at the cameras. Literally all of this stuff is RNG based, with especially some of these story details not having a great chance of actually showing up. Most of this stuff is based around the cameras, and essentially, every time you close and open it, there's a chance for certain screens to change and show something different to what we usually see. I say most, because there are actually some other RNG based elements which can be seen no matter what you're doing in game, and also some that show up in the menu screens. In terms of the two I just mentioned, the first can occur at any time during every night. There's a 1 in 1,000 chance to have multiple images flashed up on screen accompanied by some weird audio. These individual images show a close-up of Freddy with human eyes, a close-up of Bonnie Bonnie, with eyes that now appear more similar to the children's drawings on the wall, and also a black screen showing the phrase "It's me." And when it comes to the one which can be found on the menu screen, every time we're brought back to it, whether it be through a game over or simply loading up the game, there's once again a 1 in 1,000 chance to be shown the same close-up of Bonnie. However, this time, the image initially shows Bonnie with no eyes whatsoever, before briefly showing them light up as we're brought back to the menu screen. So that's the benchmark for how these little secrets are handled, with many of these varying wildly in terms of how likely they are to occur. And we're talking a range of 1 in 10 to 1 in 32,768. Some of the most common alternate screens we can find appear to mainly serve as another way of surprising the player and varying up the gameplay experience a bit more, which I think is great. These would be things like when Freddy turns towards the camera while sat on the stage, when usually he looks in the other direction. The backstage area has the potential to show 2 unique screens. The first showing both the endoskeleton as well as all the heads in the back staring into the camera, and the second one showing Bonnie staring into the camera. From there, things start getting a whole lot more interesting though, as we start seeing a heavy emphasis be placed on the "It's me" message that shows up during the brief hallucination. This phrase can sometimes be shown on the out of order sign in front of Pirate Cove, and can also be seen written onto the walls on the right hallway. In this very same hallway, the posters of Freddy, Bonnie and Chica can also be replaced with a very simplistic drawing of someone crying, this being a visual that we should definitely keep in mind when it comes to some of the sequels. The final 2 occurrences I'm yet to mention, however, serve as the most insightful and most shocking of them all. The first of those can be found on camera 4B, and through either pure luck or a more grueling process of constantly flipping your camera up and down, you'll notice that occasionally the list of rules will be replaced with something more akin to a news article. There's 4 of these that can be shown, all of which appear in a random order. However, they all revolve around 2 key things: the disappearance of some children who were last seen at the pizzeria, and the eventual closure of the pizzeria itself. The first of these starts with the headline, "Kids vanish at local pizzeria, bodies not found." The article details a situation where 2 children were led into a back room on June 26th during the nighttime. The man responsible was said to have lured these children in by dressing up as one of the mascots, whichever character he actually dressed up as currently being unknown. We then get another report telling us how a total of 5 children have now been confirmed as missing while visiting the pizzeria, all of which disappeared after once again being led into the back room by this unknown suspect. Towards the end of this one, it appears the toll this has taken on Freddy Fazbear's has been quite severe, with the company trying their best to convince people that their restaurant is still a safe place to visit. Things only seem to get worse in regards to that situation, however, as we then end up getting another article where the pizzeria has been threatened by the health department with a full-on shutdown. The reason? A foul odour that started emanating from the mascots. Several parents were also said to have contacted the police, informing them of the blood and mucus that appeared to be leaking out of the mascots' eyes and mouths. And then, the final article. Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria is said to be closing by year's end. With all the negative press, and presumably a complete drop-off in terms of customers, it seems that it was no longer sustainable keeping the place open. And even despite the owner's efforts to try sell on the franchise to another company, nobody wanted to be associated with the horror stories that came out from this place. So yeah, some pretty dark stuff, but a lot to garner from what's been said. A mysterious criminal who appears to have killed 5 children and stuffed them in the mascot suits, and also the fact this place is soon to be shut down. Naturally, this is where some connections can start being drawn in relation to what we see while playing. While parts of the pizzeria still look relatively well maintained, there's also other parts that simply appear like something out of a horror attraction. Dirt and grime covering the walls, exposed wires hanging down from the ceiling, quite a bit of trash lying around several areas. If you hadn't realised already, there's many parts of this place that appear like an absolute dump, and now it makes sense why. This place isn't being maintained properly. While the main part of the pizzeria seems to appear fine, presumably in the hopes that any potential customers might be enticed inside, everything else seems like it's being left to rot. The place is getting shut down anyway, so what's the point of putting any substantial amount of cash to keep it fresh? And when it comes to those missing kids, our attention should immediately divert to these sentient animatronics. Whatever's going on with them, we can't help but feel it's got something to do with those kids, who, let's not forget, were said to have been stuffed inside these suits by the criminal. As Phone Guy told us previously, they appear to have an active aversion towards adults, and now it's becoming slightly clearer why that is. All of them had their trust betrayed by one in just about the most severe way imaginable. But that's the thing, if we attribute these kids with almost possessing these animatronics, like they're trapped in some form of purgatory, you've got Freddy, Bonnie, Chica, Foxy, but where's the 5th child? Well, that ties directly into our final secret of the game, and the one that's the rarest of them all. When looking to the other side of the hallway on camera 2B, there's 2 instances in which the poster of Freddy can change. The first is more common, showing an image of Freddy ripping his head off. The second, however, however, shows another close-up image of Freddy, but this time with the colour of his suit being gold. The freakiest part comes when lowering your camera back down, as when coming back to your office, this golden version of Freddy will be sat right in front of you. This guy was aptly named Golden Freddy, and is the 5th secret enemy that can show up in the game. His functionality is simple, but once again has a slightly unique spin. You either open back up your camera to avoid getting jump scared, or wait around too long and witness it. The jump scare itself is different to all the others, having no animation and featuring an even more twisted version of the scream we usually hear. But on top of that, we don't actually get a game over, we instead get a full-on crash. I love when games do this, as it's something you only ever really see when it comes to games which are made for the PC. Undertale's likely the most popular example of a game that has intentional crashes built into it, and it didn't surprise me whatsoever when playing the console versions that those crashes were completely removed. While the other jump scares are more intense and clearly have a lot more effort put into them, Golden Freddy's leaves just as, if not an even more substantial impact because of how different it is. I don't find it anywhere near as startling, because you're not only given the opportunity to brace yourself when seeing him in your office, but what we see is literally just a still image. But when you have the game just cut out, you're left on your own in complete silence. As I say, because of how rare this actually is, you can't even describe him as a threat. You could hypothetically play all the way through the game 5 times in a row and never see Golden Freddy. His inclusion serves as yet another reason as to why there was so much buzz around FNAF at the time. It's something else that, because of the bizarreness and immense rarity of the situation, had players even further intrigued. Whether you'd already played the game or not, you can imagine how people would have started flocking to Five Nights at Freddy's to see if they could experience this rare secret, and even if they could potentially discover something else which no one had found yet. So that's it. That's where our story starts, and that's how Five Nights at Freddy's began. Through all the nights we've just looked at, but I think it's clear to see why this game sparked such a huge reaction from the video game community, as upon analysing it, I still come away thinking this game's been constructed exceptionally well. The look of the game is distinct, the atmosphere that's created is genuinely unnerving, which obviously is due to aspects like the stark ambience and air of mystery that I previously discussed. All the animatronics we see distinguish themselves from each other, using bright colours and varying animal-based designs to give a sense of familiarity, while pairing it up with a sinister bizarreness. And of course, when it comes to the gameplay, I think the manner in which it's structured shows a great deal of intelligence when it comes to how Cawthon carries all the individual elements out. As I discussed, it's almost like a call and response when it comes to everything here that keeps the gameplay constantly interesting, while still remaining fairly minimalist. You're based in one room, so let's have the environment fleshed out via security cameras. You've got enemies who can only kill you when you've got your camera up, so let's have one that kills you when it's down. You've got 2 doors you can use to protect yourself, so let's introduce a power meter that stops players from exploiting them. When laid out like this, it all might sound rather simple, but you have to understand that when I describe this game as lightning in a bottle, I wasn't exaggerating. To my knowledge, and I'm pretty confident when I say this, there's nothing before Five Nights at Freddy's which was even remotely similar to what this game offered. That's why this style of game essentially became a subgenre. The closest thing you can point to is the point and click nature of the game, but when looking in terms of how the game works from a gameplay point of view, the concept is entirely unique, which again is a large reason as to why the game was met with such a strong level of praise and popularity, because the video game community was being exposed to something they hadn't experienced before. It was something fresh, new and exciting, and all credit obviously has to go to Cawthon himself. Even while working purely on his own and with fairly limited resources, he managed to create something that resonated with people significantly more than most other games released at the time. And with so many questions now being up in the air when it comes to those story elements, as well as a large fanbase getting established after the game blew up, it seemed only natural that a sequel was forthcoming. With that being said, before we move on to FNAF 2, as most of you will likely know, Five Nights at Freddy's doesn't really persist of 5 nights at all. After you finish night 5, we're given our paycheck of $120, in which we can also see we were playing as a guy called Mike Schmidt, a detail that'll become increasingly more important the further we get into the series. After that, we then unlock a new night on the menu, which is simply referred to as night 6, with this night being the same as usual, but simply with the difficulty cranked up. There's no new story details to see here, and we don't even get a phone message. It's just another challenge for the player to overcome. And that's a trait of the FNAF games that only gets better with each release. We've talked about aspects like replay value, and how that can really benefit a game's longevity, and that can be felt especially strongly when it comes to these more optional challenges that lie outside the main experience. After completing night 6 and receiving only 50 cents worth of overtime pay, we then unlock the 7th and final night, with this one being referred to as custom night. With this, we can actually modify all the AI values ourselves. The challenge of beating the hardest night of all, that being where the player raises all the animatronics levels to the max value of 20, was something else that became a staple of the franchise. Almost all FNAF games from this point on will go on to feature some form of custom night, where players are given the chance to really put their skills to the test. This challenge sometimes being self-imposed, but in some cases, even having some rewards that you can garner. While I'm fairly nonplussed by Night 6, with me seeing it more as a way to unlock the custom night compared to having it be a unique night in itself, I find the custom night idea great. Alongside that challenge aspect of it, you're also given the chance to observe all these animatronics as closely as possible. Perhaps turning down Freddy, Bonnie and Chica for example, so you can see what truly makes Foxy tick, how long you're able to look away from the cameras and so on, which will obviously go on to benefit you in any future attempts at the game. Great stuff, and there's even a nice little surprise when setting the values to a certain 1987 that we've heard about before.